I'm Noemi. I'm usually based in Austin, Texas, but I'm in Mexico City as of this morning, just for the weekend. Um, and just a little bit more on my background. So I started my career in the nonprofit space, working for Sesame Workshop. So that was my first kind of touch point with storytelling and reporting. I was doing the annual report for Sesame Street, which was truly a dream job and probably why I fell in love with reporting in the first place. So I was there for a bit, and then I went to work for change.org, and I really became excited about the intersection of business and purpose and being able to move the needle from the other side of things. And so I was at change.org for a bit and then moved into consulting. And so I've been running QB since 2017, so about 8 years now, and we are a full service women-owned strategy and communications firm. So that means we do all the things under the ESG sustainability impact umbrella, including I lead the comm side, so I oversee reporting and storytelling and websites and one pagers and all the things that are comms adjacent. And then my partner out of San Francisco leads our strategy work. So that includes double materiality assessments and helping companies set goals and targets. And we do a lot of climate justice work. And we have a fully distributed workforce across the US, and we have a couple people international as well. And most of our clients are in the US, but we also have a couple spread out. And at this point, we're sort of industry agnostic. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And I'm in Austin, and I have two little girls. I have an almost 7-year-old and a 4-year-old.
John?
Great. Thanks, Noemi. It's very nice to meet all of you and join you virtually. My name is John Mandyck. I'm the CEO of Urban Green Council. Urban Green Council is a environmental nonprofit group based in New York City with the mission to decarbonize buildings for healthy and resilient communities. And big cities like New York, buildings represent 70% of our carbon emissions. And so it's the big fish that we're trying to go after in big cities like ours. Prior to this, I've been in this role for 6 years. Prior to this, I had a 25-year corporate career at United Technologies Corporation that owned brands like Carrier Air Conditioning and Otis Elevator and Pratt& and Whitney jet engines and Sikorsky Helicopter. I had executive roles in marketing, communications, government relations, and sustainability, and I retired as the global chief sustainability officer for the whole Fortune 45 company. So I bring the nonprofit and the corporate lens. I also teach at the University of Connecticut School of Business. I teach sustainability, and I just have a faculty appointment to teach at NYU starting next spring in the Stern School also for sustainability strategy. So it's great to be with all of you.
Hey, and Steve.
Thanks, Britta. Thank you so much for hosting us. Really, really happy to be here. I'm Steve Rochlin. I'm the CEO and founder of Impact ROI. Pronouns are he, him, and based in the Arlington, Virginia, Washington, D.C. area on land originally owned by the Doeg, Piscataway, and Pamunkey peoples. And I've been in the field for almost 30 years. I started out my career as the head of R&D for the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship, and then I was head of North America and Global Advisory Services for Accountability, which is one of the pioneers of the sustainability movement. And then about 12, 13 years ago, founded Impact ROI. And we are a full service ESG, sustainability, social impact, DEI advisory. We specialize in strategy, stakeholder engagement, but full service. So doing all of the reporting, double materiality, CSRD, supply chain work, carbon accounting, you name it. But our real mission is to work with our clients across all variety of industries to align financial performance with environmental and social performance. And one of the things that drives our work is a rigorous attention to research. And so we do research both in terms of advancing the field, but also in terms of understanding what's most effective in terms of sustainability. We'll be talking about that. We just had a research report that we co-published with Trellis, formerly GreenBiz, and our partners at Sandbar Solutions, which is on how to set strategy in this very, very difficult moment that the field is in right now. And we'll talk a little bit about that, about developing sustainability strategy in a successful way. And we're also best known for our business case series, Project ROI, that we've done with our partners at Babson College. I'm the lead author of it. We did our first report on the business case, which is been called the best business case for sustainability in ESG. We published that in 2015, and we're about to complete our refresh of that research, which should be out in the April-May timeframe. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. So very happy to be here.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you all online and in person for being here. So we're going to get into our panel discussion portion now. And my first question for you all is, how do you internally build support for sustainability in 2025?
Britta, I think I'm
Go.
supposed to put on that
Yeah.
one. All right. All right. Well, I love this question because we've been spending actually the last year working on it. So I mentioned this research that we've published with Trellis. It's called How to Set Sustainability Strategy in 2025, Thriving in an Era of Impact and Backlash. And what we did was we interviewed over 40 chief sustainability officers from a variety of large global companies, mostly headquarters in the US and Europe, some in Asia as well. And we supplemented that with academic research. And what we found is that there is a major difference between companies that feel like they're going to thrive in this era, and even with the backlash, the craziness, the chaos, the controversy, and those that feel like they're really struggling. And what we found is that there is a concept in management sciences called tension management, and this is something that is not about imagining emotional tension and stress, although Lord knows that is important. It's really about how leaders in a company are able to make trade-offs and understand how to deal and find sweet spots between short-term and long-term considerations and increasingly economic, environmental, and social considerations. And what we found is that companies that are leaders in being able to do what we call sustainability tension management are able to set strategies that are more likely to find sweet spots that not only balance but align financial, environmental, and social considerations, are able to make real, tangible impact for people and planet while also supporting profit. And the steps that they go through at a very high level is that first and foremost, they're very, very good at identifying their key stakeholders. And a controversial point is that while people and planet stakeholders are absolutely essential and urgent, while also increasingly investors are very important, customers are very important, employees are very important, these companies say that by far their most important stakeholder is the CEO. And this is validated by academic research, which says that the number one factor that determines whether or not your company is going to advance on your sustainability commitments or not comes down to the support or lack thereof of your CEO. So first, going through that exercise to engage and understand your stakeholders, starting with the CEO, the C-suite, building a strategy to engage them is key. The second step that they do is to better understand what we've identified as 6 sustainability archetypes. What's happening, we find in companies and through our research, is that there is unstated friction between those leading sustainability and their colleagues in different business lines and the C-suite and the board. There's an internal, often unstated set of assumptions of why the company is doing sustainability, and that will often differ between the sustainability team, which is often has an archetype of impact and purpose driven, and their C-suite, which will often have different archetypes. I won't go through all 6 right now unless we have time, but very often a very common one is that the C-suite has very often seen sustainability as a brand and reputation burnishing exercise. And they feel like that's the main reason why they're doing sustainability. And that's not what they'll say out loud. The C-suites become very practiced and very good at saying all the right things about sustainability and why they do it. But this is if you give them truth serum, they think, why are we really doing it? And they often see it as a PR and communications branding exercise. There are other archetypes too, like risk reduction, box checking, media returns. There are others that we can talk about. But what we have to do and what good companies do is they actually call these out. They don't leave them on the level of assumptions. They actually identify the differences and they work to sort of bring alignment in terms of those core views of why sustainability is going on in the company among their leaders. The third step that they take is to develop a strategy. Develop a strategy. Sustainability strategy for most companies is rather unsophisticated. It's based on strategy by target setting and a rudimentary materiality exercise. Materiality is essential and very important, but it's become a little bit too compliance driven. And we've started to set strategies around, for example, our strategy is to achieve net zero by 2050. That's actually just the start. It's not the ending. And what we've identified is that good companies go through a more sophisticated process of asking and answering core questions. Questions, for example, how important is it that we're known as a company for being good at sustainability? Is it essential, vital that we are or not? How important is different kinds of compliance requirements around the world going to be for our business and business model success? Those are two examples of the questions. There are four other core ones, plus additional ones, depending on the core archetypes that your company has. The next key step is to identify a core business case. This is where the field has really sort of lost its focus. Over the pandemic, there was a sense that sustainability had mainstreamed and companies didn't need to make a business case. And I think we're finding that that is not the best idea. And I'll come back to what we're finding on the business case, but not use up too much time right now. I'll share more of our findings on what the business case is in my next comment. And then last but not least is to really start to engage in an entrepreneurial process of sustainability where we adopt some entrepreneurial techniques of failing fast and quickly, learning and then changing, trying things out, understanding, really starting to implement programs that will identify sweet spots across financial, social, environmental, learn from them, and then move on and improve. So those are the key steps that we've learned in our research, and happy to share links to the report after this is done. Back to you, Britta.
John and Noemi, do you have anything you'd also like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, to the original question of how do you build support internally, perhaps oversimplification or a simple answer is really just making friends internally. I mean, as ESG sustainability communicators, practitioners, building relationships internally is really can make or break a sustainability, like a chief sustainability officer. And I've seen it often with my clients. I know it's soft skills and so perhaps can be overlooked, but it really does make a difference having close relationships with legal and finance and obviously office of the CEO. But I think that's something that should not be overlooked, especially at a time like right now. Everything, and I agree with everything that you said, Steve, in terms of making the business case and making sure that you're you're tying things to materiality over morality. I think everyone kind of fell into the trap in 2020 of just weighing in on a lot of issues because it felt good and we all felt good kind of being crusaders. And a lot of us in this work, that's why we're in it. We're very passionate, but it's not a sustainable way of being. And as you've noted, it hasn't served us well as the discourse is kind of changing and shifting. And so sticking to materiality and to the business case is really the smart way to go. And on that, I think you mentioned a little bit in your response on engaging stakeholders. And that's something that we always advise. That's where we advise because we're also similar to you, we're full service. And so we do strategy and comms. If we have a new client coming to us, kind of trying to stand up a practice or really starting from zero, we always advise start with materiality or some sort of stakeholder engagement exercise, because with that information, then you can create an informed story, whether it's to get buy-in internally or to tell that story externally. But without that input, you're kind of operating in a vacuum and none of us knows what we don't know, so it's a really core place to start. And I think the trend that I'm seeing of it becoming a compliance exercise is a mistake for sure. There's so much value to be gotten from the process. And there's a lot that technology cannot replace. You cannot replace that face-to-face conversation where you dig deeper into the areas that matter to core stakeholders. So materiality, stakeholder engagement is core to a lot of the work that we do. It strengthens storytelling, not just from a reporting perspective, but also getting internal buy-in. And then you also said something which I wanted to double click on, which is you didn't word it exactly like this maybe, but trade-offs compromise. I think this question and this topic is something that I'm talking about this every single day with multiple clients, kind of getting pulled into extra and longer meetings to talk about how do we make the case to continue to do our report this year? How do we make the case to keep our budget or to move forward with any of the work that we had towards CSRD when we're no longer compliant, need to be in compliance. And I think what I'm advising just from a sanity perspective, but I think it's something that as sustainability practitioners, we've always kind of had to do a little bit is finding the areas for compromise and where, trade-offs need to be made and knowing that unfortunately in this moment, there's not that kind of sweeping buy-in or energy behind things from a corporate perspective as we had a few years ago. And so knowing that, some things might have to fall off right now, it doesn't mean that they will never come back. It's just kind of picking and choosing battles and focusing on the things that are most salient and will have the biggest impact.
And I would just add, having sat in the corporate role as the chief sustainability officer, I will completely agree with Steve that the CEO is perhaps the most important stakeholder. And then once you recognize that fact, you then have to ask, okay, why are we doing sustainability? Like, well, if you're trying to build internal support, you need the CEO, but then you need to answer the question why, which the CEO is going to ask you. And the why could be different for many legitimate reasons. In our case, we were trying to build organic growth. We were trying to build markets to serve sustainable products that would grow. And so organic growth could be a strategy, but there could be other pressures on a company to answer the question why. If you're publicly traded, your investors may be asking you about it. If you're in B2B roles, your customer could be the supplier to an end customer that is asking you for that. And so you could get, in the round of all the questionnaires that are happening on sustainability that you would need to know. And certainly there's a risk of inaction, like just sticking your head in the sand is a risk to a business model for many reasons: compliance, retention, competition. I'll get into some of that in a little bit. But define the answer why first and then get the CEO on board.
Great. Thank you all for that. I think kind of going off of one of Steve's first comments, I do want to go back to how you think businesses should work on developing the business case internally for sustainability and what you would recommend for that.
So I'll start there, and certainly 2025 is a different context than 2024, and we all need to recognize that. I don't think the fundamentals change, by the way. I just think we need to understand it. There was a great article this morning by Bloomberg on this. Bloomberg has monitored for the last several years the corporate earnings calls and the mention of the word sustainability or climate change. And obviously, we are after this round of earnings calls, we're at a low back to 2021 for that. So we're in this period of what people are calling green hushing. But to be honest, it has been trailing down the last several years. But so there clearly is green hushing going on where people are not talking about sustainability as much as they have before. They don't want to stick their head above the foxhole for all the nonsense that's going on in the world. We need to recognize that. At the same time, the data is showing that fundamentally the market isn't changing, that companies are staying true to sustainability. They're just not talking about it. Investors are still interested. They're just not talking about it. So that's the context in which we're operating today, and we need to understand this. So companies, first and foremost, need to know how to navigate that. It's tricky, it's difficult. But the risk of just dumping and saying, oh, like we don't need to do this for the next 4 years, that's a risk in itself, right? Because there's a pendulum to everything. And in 4 years, things could swing back in a very aggressive way, the opposite direction. And if you're caught flat-footed, then it's difficult to catch up. But I would say, in the context, how do you build the business case right now? I see it in three areas, and it's compliance, it's capital, and it's competition. So I call them the three C's. So the compliance we've talked about, you can't anchor in any one of these, but compliance is real. particularly for larger multinational companies. In Europe, there are very strong compliance obligations around sustainability and emissions reporting and climate risk declaration. That is a risk. In the United States, the strongest that we have is in the state of California that will require the disclosure of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This impacts companies who have $1 billion of sales anywhere in the world but sell $1 into California, get swept in. And so that's a revolutionary regulation because once you lay bare scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, it's not only a difficult accounting exercise, but the implications of a company disclosing all of that has broader ramifications that I don't think companies are really thinking through right now. So there's compliance and the implications of them. That's the first one. From a capital perspective, if you're looking to merge, if you're looking for money, if you're looking for investments, um, sustainability is not going away from that perspective in the investor community. I've talked to all the deal managers and the big banks. They, view sustainability as a long-term thing. They view it um, as a abdication of their responsibility if they ignore it right now, because a 4-year cycle is short, and the sustainability risks have a long-term horizon. So I think access to capital will remain important from a sustainability standpoint. And the third thing is competition. And the first I would rank there is competition for talent. What do your employees think about sustainability? What do the people you're trying to recruit think about sustainability? When I was at United Technologies, the number one jump page from the careers page was to the sustainability site. And so, the next generation of employees are thinking and looking closely on all of these issues on what employers are doing. So competition for sure. And then just competition in the marketplace. If you are in a market where sustainability matters to your end consumer or to your business model, obviously that you just can't take the next 4 years off. So, I think as you look at the business case, particularly in the context of 2025, I would look at compliance, capital, and competition and base decisions around those.
And I'd be happy to jump in next, Britta, or Naomi, whatever you want. So I would say I agree fully with everything that John said, and I'll just embellish from there. And I mentioned that we've done this research. We did the original Project ROI research in 2015. We looked at nearly 300 academic studies. We've done the refresh. We've actually done more. We've looked at nearly 600 academic studies that test the proposition of whether or not environmental and social behaviors by companies support bottom line and top line results, inhibit them and are bad for them, or are indifferent. And we found and reinforced the core finding from our initial study in our update, and that is that environmental and social practices absolutely are drivers and supporters of financial value and performance in the company, but only if a company does them well. And that seems like a master of the obvious statement, but too often in our field and profession, people try and say that anything that we do, environmental and social performance, is good for the business. That couldn't possibly be true. And when we say that we have to do it well, that there are conditions, that actually builds trust with the board of directors and with your C-suite, that you are going to be good partners of the business. The second thing that we've learned is that really, how and why is being good environmental and social sustainability good for the bottom line and top line? Really in two big ways. That leaders who are very, very good at sustainability have two kinds of benefits. Number one, they enhance their company's performance. And number two, they increase the overall attractiveness of the business to key stakeholders. And how does that translate? Because what we've been able to do is to identify companies that are able to do it well, and we have a whole framework of what doing it well means, are able to generate results that support performance and support key business indicators. What are those indicators? Well, if you do environmental and social sustainability well, you have the opportunity to boost your share price by 6% over and above your peers and competitors. That's real money, and that's going to dwarf the amount that you're investing in your sustainability program in most instances, or what you would ever hope to invest. You have the opportunity to boost your sales by as much as 20%. What we found is that in our latest research, that works for business to consumer as well as business to business. We also find that you can boost your revenues versus your competition by up to 9%. On the human resource side, you can reduce unwanted employee turnover by almost 60%. You can also improve your employee productivity by as much as 21%. You can also reduce a whole series of financial related risks that your CFOs care about by as much as 20%. And that translates into reduced costs. So, for example, those reduced costs will mean that it costs you less to borrow money from banks and get debt capital. And it costs you less to get equity capital and to get new shareholders. It also reduces your operating costs and will boost your profitability by as much as 20% as well. There are other really fun data and statistics that's there. When we ask, how do you actually deliver this business case? I'll say very, very quickly, what I was going over before in terms of the strategy elements are absolutely vital. But when we double click on when we're going to make the value proposition and set a business case as part of that, there are a few things that we need to do. Continuing to engage with stakeholders is absolutely vital. Making sure that you are developing and have a set of internal and external allies who are invested in your performance as a good corporate citizen gives you competitive advantage. The second thing is really understanding the entrepreneurial culture of your company. Too often we don't. We get caught up in things that we think are true of our companies, but are not. I'll give you a good example that is kind of painful. How many times have you ever heard an executive say, talent is our most important asset? They say that out loud, but they don't necessarily live that at the company, doesn't feel that they're treating talent the way they should. That is a situation in many companies where it's rhetoric versus reality. The reality is that they care more about customers, or they care more about their investors and their share price, et cetera. We have to understand that entrepreneurial culture, and we have to adapt to it and align with it. The other thing we need to do is we need to make strong value propositions. There are three core value propositions that relate to what John was talking about. Those three core are defining sustainability as a feature of who we are, and that's really a powerful business case for the sustainability team to show our core stakeholders, our investors, our customers, employees, and others in communities environment that sustainability is core to our purpose. The second one is to use sustainability to drive down costs, and the third is to use sustainability to support growth. There's a lot more nuance in those, but for the time we have right now, I'll just leave it at that. And I'll mention the last thing we need to do is then we need to go to an action plan where we create a sense of priorities and understanding what kind of value proposition results we want to generate. Do we want to get small wins and do it incrementally, or are we the type of culture that needs to take big swings and make bigger investments and get bigger returns? So we need to understand that and start to prioritize and get our list of activities done. So that's all that we're learning, and we should have those results coming out in the next month and a half for public consumption. Britt, I'll put it back to you.
Can I just add, and that's awesome. I'm excited to dig into that research, Steve. I'll just add a quick note on what I said before in terms of getting to know everybody internally in the company and making friends. Part of that is also understanding what triggers people and, knowing that your CEO is the most important stakeholder. There are other stakeholders, but I agree that the CEO is key into the success or failure of a program. Understanding that person's psyche is also really important. Like what are their triggers? Are they, do they react strongly to what peers are doing in the market? Is that kind of what's kind of constantly on their mind? Because that, each business case is a story essentially. So how are you putting together that story, and what are you emphasizing, and how is that coming together to hit on those points that are going to create aha moments for leadership is also key. So that's where kind of the art of all of the making the case comes in, is really understanding what is going to get people whether it's stressed or excited, like how do people think and how can you tap into that to influence without authority?
Yeah, and actually, I think with that, this kind of goes into one of my next questions, which is thinking about these key stakeholders, CEOs or others. What kind of skills gaps do they have that need to be fulfilled so you can bring them along in this business case?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know that the sustainability as a skill set is really missing from a board level and often in C-suite too. And so it's sustainability leaders are often put in the tough situation of being the only or the expert on sustainability. And it's not, depending on the company and the brand, but it is often not widespread across the company. And so we are constantly fighting this uphill battle, which is mentally draining, especially right now. And so I think it again goes back to understanding where those gaps might be, because what I've seen a lot of times is if people don't understand something, they might, depending on the personality, but a lot of times people can become defensive and then kind of shut things down. And so what we try to do with our clients is make sure that we're first, as soon, going into a project from the outset, we're trying to get that stakeholder engagement piece in the very beginning so that and using each interview to understand where people are in their understanding so that we're not alienating people using acronyms or any like unnecessary jargon. What we kind of specialize in and have become known for is simplifying these seemingly complex topics to so that everyone can understand it regardless of their role in the company and it can click in terms of where the value is for them, not just for the role that they serve in the company, but also things that impact them in their personal, the things that they care about and the values that they hold. And so we try to go in at the beginning of any project, whether it's reporting or strategy, and conduct a stakeholder engagement exercise, get a lay of the land, understand where people are, and then use any subsequent engagements to, extract information, but also share competitive research or anything else that will help them kind of get there, depending on where the deficit may be.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think the skills gap, I think is broad, and it's in different areas, starting if you're publicly traded at the board of directors levels. Noemi just hinted at boards are not equipped to deal with this issue. And in fact, my colleagues at NYU have done good research on this, and they show that looking at Fortune 100 boards, for example, that 3% have um, somebody who is qualified from a climate perspective on the board. And so what's happening is a lot of sustainability issues are just defaulting to audit committees on boards of directors, which means they're just becoming another kind of like number crunching exercise, which there is an element to that for sure. But the implication and the strategy is not there. So that flows back down again to the CEO and the C-suite level, where many CEOs are viewing sustainability as a check the box compliance exercise. Like my supplier asked me to fill out this questionnaire, so go get the data and fill it out. Or I have to comply in Europe, so get the data and send it to them. Or I have to comply in California, get the data and send it to them. But not understanding what that means, right? And so in California, when you have to disclose your scope one, two, and three emissions, scope three, just to remind everybody, if you're a company, scope three is 80% of your emissions. It's typically your products in use. So if you make a product and you haven't already disclosed what the carbon impact is of that product over its life, now everybody's going to know. So it's questions like that, like, okay, when the world knows what the carbon impact is of your product over its life or your supply chain for making that product, and somebody does a rack and stack effect and you turned out to be at the bottom of the list, what's that going to mean from a strategy standpoint, from a business competition standpoint? And so it's those implications where there's truly a skills gap, I think, at corporate levels and company levels that people, I would urge, companies to think through those a little bit more carefully than they are right now.
And all the way on this to go back to this concept of sustainability tension management. And the research is fascinating. It shows Faculty have found that companies where leaders are very good at balancing tensions, short-term, long-term, economic environment, social trade-offs, tend to outperform in the marketplace across a variety of key financial variables. They also find that companies with leaders who are good at tension management get rated by respected third-party rating agencies as better at sustainability. And what we found is in our research is that there's a disconnect. What we found in academic plus interviews is that leaders really struggle with tension management. They haven't been trained in this. They haven't been trained at their business schools, particularly as we get into not just short versus long term, but understanding economic, environmental, and social trade-offs. They don't know that world. Who does know that world? That world is known by the sustainability team. But what's happening with the sustainability team right now? The sustainability team is feeling more and more embattled, feeling more and more like they're drawn into being a glorified reporting and compliance engine, and feeling like now that their jobs are on the line, that they may get cut, that they're persona non grata. And do they have time to be leaders and to be internal trainers, experts, bringing people along and to be better at tension management? Not in this situation. So the key thing is that identifying that this is a huge skill set that the board needs, C-suite needs, other senior executives and senior managers need. Understanding that the sustainability team, you have an untapped set of expertise, you have a natural set of skills that you need to nurture and begin to use and flow out. And then emphasizing what Noemi and have said and John have said is that we need to also get much better at the soft skills. That we come into this space and we think, oh, we need to be experts in terms of scope 3 calculations, and we need to be black belts in CSRD, and we need to get very, very technically refined. Those things actually are not too difficult to learn, and those are sort of commodified skills. They may seem complicated, but we all can learn how to do them. It's the soft skills in terms of being strategic, in terms of being good advocates, in terms of communicating, in terms of engaging people and listening to people, being entrepreneurs, change agents. Those are the skills that are most important to our success, our research finding.
Great. Thank you all. And I know we've been very focused on sustainability, but I do want to take a moment and just ask, how does the work that we've been talking about with sustainability differ from thinking about environmental justice at corporations and organizations?
I can talk about that one a little bit. So I mean, clearly everyone thinks stakeholder engagement is important, and stakeholder engagement is such a core part of climate justice and where a project can go really wrong. And I think the big difference, and this is like, a generalized statement, but for the most part, the communities that are at the forefront and that are most affected by the immediate and downstream effects of climate change are not really represented on the corporate side. Whereas, when you conduct a materiality assessment, maybe it's sort of confirming the things that you already knew, and there might be a couple of surprises here and there, but it's just kind of a tool to the process is valuable and you're bringing people along. When you're conducting a climate justice exercise, and as an example, we did a year-long study with a big telecommunications company where we engaged people in 5 markets and really wanted to understand where to invest that corporation's climate equity dollars in that sort of situation. That community is not really represented in a big way within the corporation or even on the consulting side. And so the way we look at those climate justice exercises is stakeholder engagement is a core part of that work. And we put a lot of resources and energy into investing in local communities. That means hiring local facilitators to lead that engagement. So we know that, coming from the outside and outside being interpreted in a lot of different ways, not just being foreign to the market, but also not having the same lived experiences or backgrounds as a lot of the communities that we're trying to serve for the most part. We really focus on hiring local facilitators to conduct engagements like that so that we are not only investing in the community, but also acknowledging that they are the ones who know the community best. They have deep networks. They have already been creating solutions with very little resources. They've been doing this work for a long time. And so we can be a facilitator, a liaison between the company and the community, but we never want to insert ourselves into the community and make that assumption that we, know more, or even worse, not engage the community when it comes to creating solutions. So that's part of our people-centric kind of lens, is making sure that we're creating solutions with communities and engaging them in the process so that they have a decision, they have a say in terms of where investment dollars go, versus us just making an assumption on what we think a community might need, knowing that climate justice is really affects people low income, senior citizens, people living with disabilities, people living close to the water. It affects certain communities much more than others, although in the long term we will all be affected. And of course, we all feel the ripple effects, but those communities at the forefront feel it more. And so that's a kind of a whole different side of our business. And we have, I don't know if I sent you the link, Britta, but we have a whole white paper on how we do stakeholder engagement in, with the people first lens and in the under climate justice. But I'd be happy to talk about that more. But it's a whole other theme that requires probably more time than we have today.
Steve, you want me to jump in or you want to go?
Go for it.
I would say it's a great question that, we have to focus on environmental justice, and it is different than sustainability. In many cases, these communities are the victims of the decisions that we've made, right? So where the power plants are located, where the highways were placed, are in some of our poorest communities that couldn't represent themselves or didn't have the ability or the opportunity to represent themselves when these decisions were made. But they're left with the implications of it. So that's, as we're thinking about retiring fossil fuel plants and bringing on renewable energy, we need to think first and foremost of how we do that to rectify some decisions that have been made in these communities. But beyond that, it's really, to me, it's who pays for the adaptation, right? I mean, climate risk is here, climate disruption is here. Who is going to pay for the adaptation in the environmental justice communities that have been victim to the decisions already? And don't have the ability to, fully fund the solutions. And so that's a big public policy question that we're grappling with in New York, and there are ways that we're looking at it. But I'll give you two policy decisions that are high on the agenda right now. One is New York has, and I'm sure Minnesota may have or should have, given your climate. New York has a minimum indoor temperature requirement for landlords for space. So you have to have a minimum indoor temperature. I believe it's 62 that you can't go below for health and safety. So you have to provide, the long and short of this, if you're going to rent space, you have to provide heat, and there's a minimum indoor temperature for that. Well, New York is now actually thinking of setting a maximum indoor temperature for spaces. Not many localities have done that. But that is exactly to address some of the environmental justice issues, that people don't have access to cooling, and that it is a life safety issue, right? If we set a minimum indoor temperature for life safety, well, heat is now as severe an issue for us as cold is. In fact, more people die from heat across the United States than any other weather issue, right? They don't die from cold, they die from heat. And so that's an adaptation issue that's being looked at. Another issue that is real in New York is, yes, we're a coastal city, so we're the victim of strong coastal storms that come in. New York Harbor is, by the way, 1 foot higher this century than it was the last century. And so as more storms come up the coast, there's more water that's pushed into New York. And that's a threat. But I got to tell you, having lived through it, the last few years, the greater threat comes from the sky. The intensity of rainfall that is happening has never been seen before in New York, and it's in record pace. And large urban centers aren't really built to manage that amount of water falling from the sky in a short period. And I'm sure you've seen it. where streets in Brooklyn now become canals that people take boats on during rainfalls. It's crazy. But the victims there are ground level apartments, which are not as expensive as the others, and so it's an environmental justice issue. They're in poorer neighborhoods, but they're flooding. And in some of our severe cases, people are dying because there are no egress options where the water literally just fills up in the basement and people drown. That's happened. And so to me, it's the adaptation piece for this and who's going to pay for it and how public policies are going to get designed to do that.
And if I can just add one thing, just back to the original question of, and I completely agree with all of that, just back to the question of how environmental justice is different. It's a community, the most impacted, to your point, John, have lost trust over time because they've been burned, whether it's through, stakeholder engagement exercises that come in promising a lot of things or request a lot of their time and end up being extractive, and then there's no changes and nothing is delivered. And we knew that going into this big project that I was mentioning, but we really saw it with the lack of trust. And it's not lack of trust because of us or our brand or even this particular company, our client. It's just lack of trust in institutions in general, and in big corporations and in anyone sort of coming in from outside of their community, because a lot of these, a lot of people are just wary of big institutions in general and have been burned so often in the past that, the way that we approach climate justice engagement, at least, is knowing that it's gonna take a lot longer than, a regular materiality assessment where you call somebody and you get on their calendar and maybe it takes a couple of weeks, but then you have a call with them and, usually it's not very emotional. Whereas an exchange where you're asking somebody to talk about their lived experience, and often it includes trauma, depending on the nature of the engagement, there is, it's a much more personal issue that requires a longer runway to develop trust, and to really demonstrate that. And this is something that we sort of require when we're going in as from a climate justice perspective, is making sure that whoever we're working with is committed to investing in the communities that we're engaging, so that or that the expectations are set really clearly from the outset to avoid, further burning bridges or breaking trust, because once that trust is broken, it's so much harder to build. And so we go in knowing that these engagements will take longer. It's not a one interview and get out. It's weeks and weeks or months. In this instance, this bigger project, it was a year, but usually it's months of engaging with somebody on a one-on-one, in a one-on-one group, in a group setting, and then making sure that there's a good channel flowing of communication between the company running the research and the stakeholders, so that we are developing a relationship over time and building trust versus a one-off, which often feels extractive and it doesn't really yield all of the answers that we want, and we feel could be replaced by a survey. So we often approach it from that kind of human-centered, people-first lens. So that is very different from just conducting, an interview with an investor for a materiality assessment.
And if you don't mind, Britt, if I could jump in on this, because I love everything that Noemí and John have been saying. I would add this. This is where the sort of loss of the term of ESG can be a little troubling. I'm not a big defender of the term or any of these terms, but I think when we look at environmental justice, it's most certainly involved in the wider ESG approach. And it's essential, and there's some commentary in the chat. It's essential to consider such things in our materiality process. And when we look at this, I think that there are at least two, if not three aspects of environmental justice that we have to be very attuned to. And the first is the intersection, as Noemí and John have been talking about very eloquently, about environmental challenges and social consequences, and how communities and people mostly suffer. Rare instances benefit, but mostly suffer from a changing climate, from biodiversity loss, from water stress, etc. And understanding the relationship of our business and operations and where there is some accountability or material risk or impact that we may be creating or a financial challenge that may be creating. And so understanding that and assessing how we need to contribute and engage and our obligations to engage, it's very important that we don't lose sight of that. The second big dimension that we have to pay attention to, which starts to get very complicated, is when our well-meaning environmental actions and environmental programs, solutions, and efforts to meet net zero commitments and to engage and refurbish biodiversity and deal with water issues actually may bump up against and conflict with community well-being, and it does happen. There's an obvious one that actually is playing out in the United States of America right now. It's maybe not the central part of this debate, but it is part of the debate, and that is that the transition from fossil fuels away from fossil fuels will mean job loss and capital loss and transfer and winners and losers. Um, uh, and that can be painful for some. So understanding that is something that we have to be attuned to, um, uh, and understanding if there are particularly vulnerable populations that will be affected and how we make those choices. It goes beyond that. There was a great example of a client that we were working in that was trying to invest in a pristine part of Mexico, and which has a high rate of wind, and major financial services institution that was our client, and trying to put up and invest in wind farms there. What would be wrong with that? Well, it was being done on indigenous land without the free, prior, and informed consent of those groups, and was going to affect both sacred land as well as their way of life and well-being in certain areas, and creating kinds of risks. So, the good, well-intended effort to support climate mitigation was bumping up against the well-being of communities, and we needed to go through a process, as Noemi was talking about, in terms of stakeholder engagement and negotiation, of understanding needs, of understanding alternatives, of engaging and receiving and getting the free, prior, and informed consent, or of not finding alternatives. And so those are two fundamental practices that a good approach to ESG and sustainability needs to emphasize.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, I mean, that's one of the biggest aha moments that I had around well-meaning initiatives that can go terribly wrong without engaging the right people that I had many years ago in grad school. And one of the reasons that the people first thing is, I know it's a probably overused term at this point, but it really is like making sure that the right people are in the room when these decisions are being made. So I could not agree more with that.
Great, thank you all so much. I know we're coming up almost to the Q&A portion, so just one more question that I will ask you to answer quickly. We'll see. But kind of what is one thing that you see keeping sustainability and environmental justice work moving forward through the next few years?
I think from my perspective, I think it's not moving fast enough. I'm not answering your question, but I think where I see cool projects that are well done moving forward is when the person leading the project or holding the budget accepts comes to the project from a with the lens of humility and knowing that they don't hold all the answers, and that's where really truly deep stakeholder engagement is possible. And I think when I see things go wrong or where, the community is not engaged is when well-meaning sometimes people come in trying to push solutions down people's throats and go off of maybe past research that's been done or just desk research. And I think I cannot emphasize enough how important stakeholder engagement is. And so I think I can't point to from my experience at least, the projects that we've done have often come from one really passionate, engaged person at the company wanting answers and trying to answer the question of whether the company is even the right player to invest in the market or in the community and trying to answer the question of whether they have the social license to operate. That's kind of where I've seen things. So I think it still is up to people holding the purse strings to kind of push that work forward, at least in the projects that I've seen that are being done really well. Because I think it still feels like an afterthought, and I think even though environmental work on the whole is moving forward, and there's a lot of emphasis on, what can be measured, which is the GHG account, scope 1, 2, 3, and like all the things that you can track, and the numbers are easy to kind of show progress. Environmental justice work, just like DEI and all the kind of human capital things, it's much harder to demonstrate that ROI and that impact. And so I think it's, from my perspective, not moving forward fast enough because it's much harder as we're kind of people are picking and choosing areas of focus. It's much harder to move that work forward. Not the best, not a not an optimistic response, but that's where I'm landing.
I think the one thing holding us back is paralysis. Reading the doom scrolls today of what's going on from the craziness coming from Washington, D.C. I think people don't know what to do and they're worried and they're paralyzed on this issue. And I think that's a mistake. Um, you know, I, I'm often asked by students and other things, is sustainability dead now? And my answer is hell no. And I think sustainability will live and grow for three reasons. I wrote this in a Harvard Business Review article that you're welcome to take a look at if you want to go deeper in it. But the three key reasons I think we're going to move forward is cities and states are going to lead. Um, this happened last time around, and it's going to continue to happen this time around. Um, there are 24 states now that are committed to the U.S. Climate Alliance. So these are governors that have signed up for the Paris Climate Accord. That represents 60% of our economy and greater than 50% of our population. So while the federal government pulls us out of the Paris Climate Accord, it cannot take the entire country into retreat. And so we have to keep that just kind of in mind. Secondly, if you look at just globally, I think China is going to fill the void here and continue to drive sustainability demand. Two-thirds of all the renewable energy projects in the world are now in China. And China is starting to really build out its renewable energy technology that they're going to want to export to the rest of the world. They already are. So it's in their economic interests that the world move forward with net zero so they can provide the technology to do so. And then finally, the biggest one is Mother Nature doesn't care who's in the White House. Like climate change is going to do what it's going to do, and it's doing it faster than we ever thought it could. The climate disruption is just on top of us, and it's bad. And so, no matter how much you want to deny climate change, you cannot deny the risk that's in front of us, particularly the economic risk, right? Just over the course of 10 days, the insurance companies lost $30 billion in LA with the horrific fires and the loss of life that happened there. They cannot go through 10-day, $30 billion events anymore. Like it's just not going to work, right? And so for those three reasons, I think sustainability is going to move forward and we're going to have to get over the number one barrier, which is going to be paralysis.
And I'll jump in and say amen to both of those answers. Let's look domestically right now because environmental justice might seem as if one that's going to be too steep a hill to deal with. But actually, it may not in certain instances. Number one, environmental justice and environmental issues is a real problem for the political right now. And they know it's a problem. Coming at you from Washington, this is known by the political right in the United States as an issue that could very well lose elections for them. And they're in a rock and a hard place right now dealing with their constituencies. Why is that? Let me give you a very tangible example. We're doing a project right now looking at regenerative agriculture in the United States. And we're dealing with farm belt states. We're dealing with farmers, smaller farmers who tend to vote very, very conservatively. These farmers are true believers in climate change. They're seeing it happen to their farms, to their yield, to their output. They need help, and we are seeing that they are furious at the nature of the dialogue and the debate and the discussion going on right now in Washington, D.C. They feel betrayed and they don't feel heard or seen. And so that's just one example right now that we see that on the ground constituencies that to sort of um, build off of what John was saying, that Mother Nature isn't stopping for anyone. Mother Nature also isn't differentiating between left and right wing voters. And so, in many respects, climate is having bigger effects in areas that tend to vote towards the right. So, if there are nervous people within your businesses who are saying, no, we got to stay away from this as a third rail, don't talk about this stuff right now, actually, that's not true. Starting to engage a variety of stakeholders, including state and local officials, is very, very key. It's very important that we use the right kind of language and language that isn't seen as triggering a kind of response or seeing over politicized type of language on this. Environmental justice, unfortunately, might be a combination of two words that might be triggering. It might not be the right phrase to use. Environmental fairness might be a better alternative. There are other things to think about. But understanding this and understanding that it actually isn't a loser in the political scheme right now, it actually very much is and will be a winner going forward, is something key. The second thing is to understand the connection between materiality and the business case. And what that means is that for many of the companies on this, there are going to be environmental justice issues, which both from an impact perspective and a financial perspective are things that will make your list of priorities and should be addressed. But not every environmental justice issue will for your organizations. And that's one thing that we have to start to become a little bit more disciplined and focused as a sustainability community, because we tend to say yes to everything. And we tend to say everything is an urgent priority that our businesses need to deal with. And I understand that because these environmental justice issues are all urgent for the stakeholders that are affected by them. But no one organization can do everything and be everything to everyone. And so understanding the ones that are right for our organizations to engage in is going to be absolutely critical going forward.
All right, great. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate all of what's been discussed. And now I'm going to open it up for questions. And the first question I see in the chat is from Wesley, thinking about materiality findings are essential for executive level engagements, but is it too much pressure on employees' shoulders by focusing on the business case versus showing how they can live the organization's values and purpose and showing how the company is staying the course?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that if we can. Let's have an honest conversation about the organization's values. There are certain kinds of organizations that are famous for establishing strong values and living them. You may, I'm not sure, Wesley, which company you're with, and you may be in one of them. And those are the types of things where the leaders, and it's been passed down from generation of leader to generation of leader, and they say the decisions that we make are based on those core values, and we trust and have the experience and history that if we make decisions based on that, we know that profits will follow. And we have faith in that, and we have experience and data. Those organizations, unfortunately, are rare. It's much more the case in which companies have a list of 3, 4, 5, 6 value statements. We all know what they are. We're collaborative. We have integrity. We can think about what they are. They're words on a page. And when you see research, and I've done this with our clients too, where we survey employees to say what, from memory, name the core values, they can't do it. And that the leaders don't lead that way, that there are unstated values that they're leading by. And very often those unstated values are much more related to profit and loss metrics. And that's why we have to sort of emphasize the business case. The other challenge is that we have to also understand that sustainability and environmental and social sustainability has been developed in a context in which we've had a strong deregulated environment in the United States and increasingly around the world. And so the sustainability movement has adopted government and sort of NGO perspectives, and tried to sort of use an end run to get what used to be regulated done voluntarily. But we have to understand that for the most part, these are voluntary activities with soft regulations behind them. Even a CSRD is a soft regulation, not a hard regulation. And in that context, we have to understand that first and foremost, and legally, our companies are obligated, particularly if they're publicly traded, to drive certain fiduciary results. And that within that context, we have to exist and live within it. The other thing that we have to, in doing so, we have to show how we're contributing to the overall value and results of that business. Otherwise, we'll be seen as something that is a square peg in a round hole in our enterprise. But in doing that, that's not a bad thing because we have long said in the sustainability movement that we don't get sufficient resources and budget. And that how can we truly make change when we're thought of as being a remainder and an afterthought in terms of operating expenditure and capital expenditure. So what we want to do is we want to get into the main game. We want to get real resources. We want to get real budget allocated to us. And the only way we get real budget allocated to us is not through regulation because our companies are research shows our companies are all very, very good at performative compliance and sort of weaving in and out of regulation. Regulation is not often transformative for business. What's transformative is the profit and loss driver. And if we can show that being sustainable is going to give us enduring competitive advantage and financial advantage, that will then help us get the resources we need. And that will help us live our corporate values much more than it will if we trust in the value statement to do it for us. My 2 cents.
Okay, well, I don't see anyone else unmuting to answer, so I do want to get to the next question, which Christine just put in the chat, that John mentioned China will lead the world in sustainability moving forward. Any thoughts or research on what India is doing or can do?
Yes, certainly, India and China and the Philippines and Indonesia more. I mean, these are countries all on the front lines of sustainability right now because um, they have large population growth in some of those countries, um, and they have massive urbanization that's happening. In the United States, we're about 80% urbanized, meaning like even our towns are considered urban centers, meaning like we're 20% agrarian, 80% non-agrarian. In developing countries, that's still not the case. I mean, in India, India's last time I looked, about 30% urbanized. And so just over the next 15 to 20 years, this massive move of people into cities for economic opportunities create enormous climate challenges, right? Because just of the built environment that needs to happen for it, and the transportation context. So India has been very strong from a green building standpoint, recognizing that and what needs to happen to make buildings more energy efficient, and the types of materials that are used there, just to manage this massive influx of urbanization. China is well ahead of it, by the way, and so India is next in line from that standpoint. Another huge issue in India is food waste, where food is just not getting from the farm to people's forks. That has an enormous climate implication. I co-authored a book on this several years ago. If you measured food waste as a country, it would be the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. That's how much food we throw away, but that's also the carbon intensity of producing and transporting food that never gets to where it needs to be. And in case of India, food's being transported in the back of a open pickup truck in 100-degree heat to an open air market where it sits out, and then too much of it rots before it gets to the consumer. So I mean, India has a big role to play. India is leading with software technology to help answer a lot of these questions, and so it's clearly a place that we should focus on and think through what are the opportunities there, just as a enormous country that's moving through urbanization and grappling through these issues real time.
We want to take a chance and find out if anyone in person has any questions. Oh yeah.
So Audrey Broback, I'm with Excel Energy. something Steve said early on, but I'd like to ask the whole panel. So ESG is a driver and supporter of profit. If you do it well, how would you define doing sustainability well?
Yeah. I can jump in on that because we've got a whole set of research on it. So listen, there are a whole things that we would normally go to in answering what doing sustainability well would mean. And doing sustainability well, we would normally start by saying, well, we do a materiality assessment, and then based on that materiality assessment, if we would imagine that there are certain things that come out of it, such as for most companies, climate change, such as treating your employees well, such as responsible sourcing, et cetera, a whole set of activities that we know. All of those things are incredibly important. And all those things are involved in doing sustainability well. But here's an interesting thing. What we find in the research is that if we want to do sustainability well in a way that supports our business and makes real impact, what the research finds is that there's an inverted U-shaped curve. What it means is that the more we commit to sustainability and the more we do environmental and social activities, particularly that relate to material things, the more it supports our business up to a certain point in which it starts to decline. And we start to do too much sustainability, it actually hurts our business and it limits our ability to make real impact. We overcommit, we start to boil the ocean. What is that point of transition? Well, it's going to unfortunately be customized and be different for every organization. How do we find what that is? There's a couple of ways to start. Number one, do a materiality exercise, and for your material issues, particularly as it relates to your industry, it's probably going to be useful for whatever rating system you think is useful to be in the at least second quartile of performance or at the high end of the top quartile. If you look at the top 20 performers, being in the 20 to 10 rank space, you don't necessarily need to be number one. The second thing to do is to go out to identify your key stakeholders and assess what's important to them, what they expect for you. Your stakeholders being your investors, your customers, your employees, environmental key stakeholders, community key stakeholders. See what their priorities are. That's where you want to lead. That's where you don't want to underinvest. That's where you want to be excellent and a leader and differentiate yourself. So we start with that. The second thing that doing it well means is understanding and aligning to the entrepreneurial culture of your company. This is something that sustainability teams struggle with, and understanding what is our company, what really drives our company. So for example, if you're Walt Disney, brand is central to the entrepreneurial culture of your company. If you're not doing anything that's supporting, growing, and increasing brand value, you're not in the game at Disney. ExxonMobil is an example of a company where operational excellence is key. If you're doing sustainability at ExxonMobil, it's not an easy thing to do, but they've got a big team there. You really need to identify and align with operational excellence. So we have to understand the entrepreneurial culture. We have to be great at sustainability attention management, as I was talking about. The other thing that companies who do it well do is they define core value propositions, as we talked about. And then the last thing they do is they set key action plans, and particularly in making the business case and making activities, understanding whether based on the entrepreneurial culture, whether you need to move incrementally, build confidence, and then build up to bigger, more ambitious activities, or whether you're the type of company that likes to take big swings, go big or go home, and start with real sort of transformative initiatives, actions from the get-go, or some combination of both in some organizations. And there's a pithier way that our research summarizes this, but those are the elements that companies that do sustainability well, companies that follow those things get that win-win, are able to drive business value and make more tangible impact for people and planet.
Oh, John, you're muted.
Sorry. In addition to all that, which I agree with, I would jump in and say it has to be real because it hasn't. And I can point to 2018 as kind of the watershed moment on this. In 2018, Yahoo Finance started to publish ESG scores on companies, publicly traded companies. So if you go to Yahoo Finance and you'll see a number of tabs, typically people go to check a stock price, but you'll see who, what are the sales, what are the profits, who are their insiders, what's the corporate history, the financial history, and all the way over on the right there was an ESG tab, and you published first in 2018, and you clicked on it, and you got the Sustainalytics ESG score for every publicly traded company. And I was there in the corporate suite. There was a moment in time in 2018 where every CEO stood up and said, "What the hell is ESG? And why do I have a score? And why does it suck? And who is Sustainalytics? I didn't do any of this." And what they found out is you get a drive-by ESG score, whether you want it or not, right? They just look at your website, and what you disclose, you get an ESG score. And so that created this herd rush to say, oh my God, what do I do about this, right? Well, it was like, oh, well, we have to be net zero. So in 2019, every company became net zero. We have a net zero pledge. We're net zero. We're net zero. We're net zero. And three-quarters of them were wrong. And I'm not saying they were wrong intentionally, they were just wrong naively, right? And so companies started to cherry pick the emissions they wanted to report. Some reported scope one, maybe scope two, none reported scope three, but they kind of made it look like they were reporting all emissions, and everybody got confused. Everybody. So then you got to 2020 and 2021 after this, coleslaw of pledges that made no sense. The investor community stood up and said, we can't tell anything anymore. We can't. We can't believe anything anymore, and we can't compare anything anymore. And so then you saw the rush to standardization, right? And you saw it, and then we had a political change, right? And so you saw the SEC under the Biden administration trying to standardize these terminologies so that investors could make decisions about what was real and what wasn't. And then companies started to clean up their act, right? So what I would just say is nobody believes companies anymore because of that, right? A company may stand up and say, I have a net zero pledge. Let me just tell you, I don't believe it. Unless I go into it and I can actually see everything. My first take is, I'm sure you think you do, but my guess is you really don't. And that's the reality of how the world is looking at it. So even if you do all the right things and you're trying to do the right thing, if it's not real, like in the case of in climate emissions, it's all about scope one, two, and three. If it's not real, the company's not going to be trusted.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Steve, do you have any research or sources on that U curve? Oh, you are answering it in the chat. You're on top of it. So I think we have time for about one more question. Does anyone in person or online have a question? Feel free, online folks, to just unmute yourself at this point.
I'll unmute myself and just say, first of all, thanks all three of you for a great conversation. I work in the service industry as well as an ESG sustainability professional, and a lot of what you said I've heard from clients and other conversations, but it's always great to hear it confirmed from a group outside the Minneapolis, St. Paul region for sure. And one of the things that Noemí talked a little bit about and mentioned that really resonates with the type of work that I find myself doing quite a bit of is the importance of the stakeholder engagement piece. And specifically, and this stems from years working here in the state of Minnesota with our tribal communities, is the importance of taking the time to have those difficult conversations and to gain the trust of the community or client that you're working with. And a number of people on this call know that's important working with tribes and the folks that are involved there. So that I really wanted to comment on that, and I appreciate again all of your comments.
Thank you.
Take a long drink of water. Just finish it up, see if anyone has anything else.
Hmm.
All right. There we go. You have one more?
I have one more.
Yes.
Okay.
Go for it.
Last one. So I'm thinking on environmental justice and the business case for environmental justice, specifically with your legal team. One of the barriers I've found in that program is words like liable and at fault coming up when we're starting to have conversations about environmental justice. Just wondering if you had any thoughts around those conversations with a corporate legal team.
Yeah, I can definitely jump in on that. Um, so just a quick question for you. Well, can you share the industry that you're in or the company that you're in?
Yeah, Excel Energy, the energy power space.
Yeah, so that's going to be tricky for energy because I was going to say that, one of the easiest things to do with the legal team is not call it environmental justice
Yeah.
because trigger them in just the ways you're talking about, unless you are in certain industries like energy or mining or utilities or things like that, where actually that word starts to come up a little bit more. And so I think the key thing right there is that the legal team, and this gets back to what we were talking about in terms of understanding the archetypes of understanding of different teams and how they understand the importance of sustainability in their company. The legal team often leads to one of two archetypes about why they think sustainability and ESG should be at the company. Unfortunately, they're classic box checkers, and those are the most difficult to deal with, which says we only want to check the box, and that means we do the least amount humanly possible on environmental and social activities. The second type of archetype that they're ruled by is risk reduction. And that gives us more of an opportunity because they start, if you can actually use a little bit of their momentum against them, a little bit of jujitsu, and starting to engage with them to say, before we need to do this because there are complaints, because we have done wrong, because it is against our values, because there are expectations from key stakeholders in which we should do this. That will fall on deaf ears for a legal team, most legal teams, not all, but let's say less enlightened legal teams. Um, if we start approaching the legal team understanding of risk reduction and starting to say to the legal team, we can address liability issues. We can engage with this without admitting fault or wrongdoing. We can engage without necessarily, if no one is asking for an apology from us, we don't have to proactively apologize. What we can do is look at this from something that you're more attuned to and more comfortable with, particularly in an energy utility, and that is saying community risk. And the way that utilities have decades of history of good community relations to lower community risk and build support that has a demonstrated business case for energy utilities and all kinds of utilities, and saying that there are, along with the risk work we've been doing, community relations work, we need to think about the ways in which these communities are affected by environmental factors that address and touch the services that we provide. And the key thing that we need to do is to engage with them and understand how we can ameliorate some of those issues, and show that we are a concerned and good corporate citizen, so they can continue to remain supportive, both as customers, as political supporters, as reputation-related supporters, and vital members of our service territory that are thriving and supporting wider economic development and growth. And if we can start to, and I'm sort of oversimplifying things and saying things in a more generic way that a utility might think about it in this particular case. But we start to have a conversation that way, as opposed to the way that one might have the conversation with a community of sustainability professionals working with community activists. Um, we start to change the language, shift it, use things that the legal team knows and is experienced with, and is engaged in, is less scary, less intimidating, and more familiar with them. It's a way to engage them as a key stakeholder as well.
I agree with that, and I'll just kind of like underscore that approaching it from a community risk slash social license to operate perspective, I've seen work well, and also framing it as like as a market research exercise to begin, to just like we are collecting information. And often when we're doing these sorts of projects, the value that we bring is that we are that in between. So we, as the consultants, assume that risk, and that is very clear in the contracts. If anything goes wrong, like, it's our brand on the line versus, and so it's framing it that way to a legal team as like there's kind of like a middle person conducting that engagement, and they will be kind of leading, they will be the face of the engagement. And then as legal team becomes comfortable with insights coming out, that relationship can change in a subsequent scope of work. But if it's a very risk averse or difficult to crack legal team, framing it from that perspective as like, this is a market research exercise. We're really collecting information on the social license to operate, and the brand can be masked to begin. And we have a third party that's, absorbing that risk, that can be easier to pass, especially for companies that are, for large companies, or for teams that are more kind of closed off.
All right. Well, I just want to take another opportunity to so much thank Steve and John and Noemí for being just fantastic speakers and for being part of this panel. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.